So if you're a caregiver out there, it is my hope that you will somehow hear these words that I'm sharing. My name is Heidi Crockett. I just wrote a workbook on caregiver stress, and I want to talk a little bit today about what I feel like is wrong with the healthcare system and the current paradigm around caregiving. And why I say there's something wrong is that if you look at the statistics, caregivers are more likely to develop cardiovascular disease and hypertension, which is high blood pressure. And we know that 60% of the time, the caregiver will die before the person with dementia. So why is this? The studies show that it's not caregiving per se that causes higher mortality rates, but stress and how the caregiver responds to stress. So I was a caregiver myself. I took care of my husband for about 3 years. We were on a journey together. He had a brain tumor, and he passed away, unfortunately, about 6 years ago. I'm also a social worker. I've been working in the healthcare system for over a decade. And this book that I wrote, it's called Caregiver Stress, Neurobiology to the Rescue, is a workbook which helps caregivers reflect on the experiences they're having. So, for example, this is what's problem with the current paradigm. Okay, the caregiver goes to the doctor's office. It's always about the patient. Always about the patient. No one really asks the caregiver how they're doing. Even if you go to a caregiver seminar, right? You might have someone from a very professional institution like the USF Alzheimer's Bird Institute talk for an hour. Someone else talks for an hour. Someone else talks for an hour. So the problem is, again, the caregiver is constantly externalized, looking for outside him or herself for information. This is the problem. This is at the core of the problem, in my opinion, and this is why I wrote the book. See, the book has useful information in it about what happens in the brain when there's stress, because I tried to make the book very science-based, but I feel like the most useful purpose for the book is actually the exercises at the end of each chapter, which ask the reader to reflect on what they've read and apply it to their lives. Because, for example, the caregiver needs to think about where is the strong emotional charge. Like, what is it about caregiving that stresses them out the most? Because it's going to be different for each person. And if you can get a handle on where that charge is originating from, then you can begin to break down and also break down what the answer is and what are the solutions to addressing the stress response for that specific circumstance. Like, for example, if the caregiver gets really stressed out around medical things, maybe there's a way that they could bring in, for example, a geriatric care manager or some other professional who could help team with them and thus reduce the caregiver's stress, because things related specifically to medical stuff really stresses them out. But maybe they really enjoy cooking for their loved one, or maybe the opposite is true. Maybe as a caregiver you really enjoy advocating for your loved one in the medical setting, but sometimes doing certain caregiving tasks in particular really try you. So the workbook asks in the very beginning, what is it about caregiving that stresses you out the most? And then it uses interpersonal neurobiology and Dr. Siegel's triangle of well-being to define optimal mental health. So there's 3 tips to this triangle. 1 tip is empathic relationships, 1 tip is a coherent mind, and 1 tip is an integrated brain. And the book goes into the science behind why each of these 3 tips are equally important to cultivate in order to have an optimal mental health state and to be a better caregiver. And then at the end of the book, it moves from a wellness triangle to a wellness pyramid, and I add another dimension. And at the top, this tip, I call it the spiritual tip at the beginning of the chapter, but then I have the reader name it. So some people might call it God, whatever you want to call it, nature. The important thing when I make it into a pyramid is to add the dimension of meaning. Because like successful grief resolution, it's shown. It's about making meaning of your experience. And also, I believe that for successful stress reduction, there needs to be a larger story, a story which cultivates and uses the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex of the brain is the part around your forehead, and it's where higher reasoning originates, complex thought, and like basically it's the part of your brain that thinks about thinking. Their intuition, morality, fear modulation, more complex thought originates from the prefrontal cortex. And that's what I recommend in the book, is being reflexive on your current state and then using that to cultivate better habits. The issue for caregivers is that the chronic stress of caregiving shuts off the prefrontal cortex. And what is left often is the limbic brain, which is kind of in the middle of your brain. And that is where the fight, flight, freeze mode originates in the stress response, and where the body will be secreting high doses of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So, and this is, I believe, the secretion of the cortisol, what leads to the health problems for the caregiver, is because their limbic brain is firing, and they don't, because the caregiving is so stressful, they don't cultivate moments where they're able to slow down and use their prefrontal cortex and think through their circumstances, and also cultivate habits which help to turn off the limbic brain. Habits like just watching your breath or meditation. I talk about Dr. Siegel, how he introduces meditation to his patients, just saying that it's basically like brain floss, not necessarily anything religious, but it clears the synapses in the brain. So if you are interested in what I've been talking about here, I would recommend the book. It's called Caregiver Stress, Neurobiology to the Rescue. And my name is Heidi Crockett, and I can be reached at HeidiCrockett.com. It's HeidiCrockett.com.